Hello everyone. When last we talked about the citric acid cycle. Now today, we're going to talk about the ETC, or the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is that stair step that we drew earlier in the lecture. Electrons travel from one molecule to the next, losing energy each time, and at the bottom of the chain is oxygen, one oxygen, not molecular oxygen, one oxygen atom, and two electrons come down the chain and stick to that oxygen, and we get H2O in the process. Okay, so the electron transport chain is a series of electron carriers, and basically NADH and FADH2, those molecules we talked about earlier, drop off their electrons up here on the top of the stairs, right? And I'll give you a hint of what's coming up. NADH puts them right here at the top of the stairs, and FADH2 drops them off part way down the stairs. And those electrons travel down and they release energy. So energy is released with each transformation as the electrons are passed from one molecule to another, and that energy is used to generate ATP. It's important to pay attention to details, what I just said there, because students miss this all the time. The energy from those electrons is used to make ATP, not the electrons themselves, the energy from the electrons. The last acceptor of the electron at the very end of the chain is oxygen. And remember, oxygen is very electronegative, meaning I'm just going to put this in crude lingo, it likes electrons, right? It can really grab a hold of electrons. It has an affinity for electrons. And at the end of all this process, we'll explain how all of this works. 28 ATP are going to be produced. And I have that tittle again. That means about, because it's not 100% efficient. But it's about 28 ATP are produced by this process, okay? Now, here is the electron transport chain. Now, where are we? This is taking place in the cristae, those folds of the inner membrane. So here's the outer membrane, here's the inner membrane, and the matrix is in the middle. I'll just put an M there. That didn't quite work. M. These proteins are embedded in this membrane, in the folds of that inner membrane. They're stuck into it, and we'll see how proteins stick into membranes in a future lecture if you haven't learned it already. Okay, so here's NADH. NADH dumps off 2 electrons. And I want you to note, I don't want you to memorize all of these chemicals, okay? But what I do want you to note is that there are 4 complexes. I do want you to know that there's 4 protein complexes. What is a complex? A complex is when you have a bunch of enzymes or other proteins stuck together, kind of like a factory. So this one does one job, like it might be an enzyme that produces a molecule, then it goes to this one, then it goes to this one. So they're all stuck together in a complex. So it's several enzymes, for example, stuck together in a complex. So there's complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'd like you to know that. NADH dumps its electrons off at complex 1. FADH2 dumps its 2 electrons off at complex 2, partway down the stairs, right? Then these electrons are passed from one molecule to the next, down the chain, and at the very bottom of that chain, waiting at the end, is, you can see there's a complicated mess right here. What is this saying? It's saying there's 2 hydrogen ions floating down here, and half of an O2. Well, what's half of an O2? That's an O, right? So half of an O2. So these 2 electrons come down and they glue these hydrogen atoms to this oxygen, and you get basically a water molecule. You get H2O, right? At the end of all this. That's what we see right here. So at the very bottom of this is oxygen. Oxygen is very electronegative. You can think of it like a magnet pulling electrons down this chain. They go down, down, and they lose energy. Every time they go from one molecule to the next, energy is lost. Some of it is heat, but some of it is able to do work, okay? And this process is going to make ATP, but you haven't seen how exactly yet. But I'll show you how in just a little bit. But that's how this works. I wanted to point out that this molecule here, Q, is CoQ10, which they sell as a supplement, and it probably doesn't do anything when you take it, but you may have heard of it before. Okay, now, this is the cool part. I don't know if any of you have ever played the game Mousetrap. Here, I'm going to pause the video and put a picture of the game Mousetrap in. Why? Because this is a video, and I have... Okay, so this is a video, and I have the power to stop it and add pictures as I please. So here's the game Mousetrap. It's this overly complicated game where a ball rolls down a chute and goes into a bathtub, and it makes this move and makes that move, da-da-da-da-da, and eventually this trap falls on a mouse. And it hardly ever works right, but it seems overly complicated, and to me, this process seems kind of like that. If I could design a process, I could design a more elegant process. But what you'll learn as you study biology is that biology isn't perfect. Life isn't perfect. It's a series of like duct tape solutions, compromises, and weird evolutionary processes that work, but they're nowhere near perfect. And I think cell respiration reminds me of that fact all the time. So let's look here. So energy released from electrons, which we saw before as they go down the electron transport chain, those different molecules. So we have complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, remember, and those electrons, two at a time usually, 2 E minus, right, are going down this chain, and at the bottom is an oxygen, right? As they go down those stairs, they release energy, and that energy powers pumps. We haven't talked about that yet, but some of the proteins in these complexes are pumps, and they are pumps that pump hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions are also known as protons. So an H plus ion is the same thing as a proton. Basically, a proton is part of a nucleus of an atom, right? And a hydrogen atom is a proton plus an electron. Right? Why did I draw that? It's a proton plus an electron, but because it's an ion, it doesn't have the electron. So all it is a proton. So a hydrogen ion is just a proton. Okay? So the energy from these electrons going down the stairs is released. Some of it is lost as heat, but some of it pumps hydrogen ions. So and I want to show you, it pumps them from the matrix. So if we draw mitochondria, once again, there's the inner membrane. Here's the outer membrane. Here's the matrix inside here. It pumps them from the matrix into the intermembrane space, this area between the membranes, okay? It's pumping hydrogen ions out there, and it's making a high concentration of ions. High concentration, and then here is a low concentration. Now when I'm recording this video anyway, some people may watch this in the future. When I made this video, the students have not learned about osmosis and diffusion yet directly in this course, but I will tell you that when you have something in a high concentration, it likes to spread out, and it will go to a low concentration, right? Things go from high to low if possible. So right now you have this super high concentration over here and a low concentration over here, and there's a little tunnel in the membrane right here that lets hydrogen ions through, so they flow back through again. So like I said, this seems overly complicated, right? So the energy from your food that you eat goes the food you eat gets digested, then pieces of that food go to your cells, and then glycolysis takes place. You steal electrons from your food. Those electrons go down a transport chain. That transport chain pumps hydrogen ions, and remember I mentioned earlier there's hydrogen ions created at different steps. This is where they become important. Those hydrogen ions are pumped across a membrane, and then they flow back to the other side of the membrane again through the process of diffusion. And they're flowing through like crazy, okay? Now, why are they doing this? Well, this is kind of like a dam. Here's a dam. And on one side you have a high concentration of water, and down here you have a lower concentration of water. Well, what happens if you put a hole right here in the dam? Water shoots out, right? There's a hole right here. Hydrogen ions pass through like crazy. And so, just like in a dam, if you put a wheel right here, you could generate power, right? Water coming out of the dam would generate power by spinning that wheel. You can put molecules here that make ATP, and the flowing of hydrogen ions will power the production of ATP. Okay, like I said, a lot of weird extra steps here, but let's see how it works. Here it is all put together. I want to show you this process and add some terminology to it. So here's complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there's another part you need to know. This molecule right here, this enzyme called ATP synthase. ATP synthesizes ATP. All right, so let's look at what happens. Electrons are flowing through these molecules, and then this membrane here, this is that inner membrane that we've talked about. So electrons are flowing through. The energy from those electrons are being used to pump hydrogen ions out here. So hydrogen ions are being pumped up here. They're in a high concentration up here. They flow through a tunnel. This tunnel is ATP synthase. They flow through it. And the flowing of hydrogen through ATP synthase provides the activation energy to glue ADP to a phosphate group, making ATP. And ATP then goes off to power other parts of the cell, like your ability to think, feel, and breathe are all powered by ATP. So that's how it's made. Now this part of the process here is the electron transport chain, right? This process here where hydrogen ions flow through is known as chemiosmosis. Osmosis is a kind of diffusion, which we'll talk about later, but this is chemiosmosis, which means it's a chemical that's flowing through the membrane. Chemiosmosis is the flow of hydrogen ions through the membrane. And all of this combined has the fancy term oxidative phosphorylation, because ultimately we're using oxygen to glue phosphate to ADP, right? Making ATP. So oxidative phosphorylation is this whole process. The electron transport chain part is the part where electrons flow and hydrogen is pumped. Chemiosmosis is the part where those hydrogen ions flow through the membrane. So those are the parts. So oxidative phosphorylation has those two parts, transport chain and chemiosmosis, but all together we can refer to the whole thing as oxidative phosphorylation. You might want to watch this part of the video a couple times, right, to get the hang of that. And I might try to draw that here in a minute. So I'm going to stop the video and then continue on this because I don't want this video to get too long. And we'll draw this out one more time and we'll build on it, and then we'll move on to photosynthesis very shortly.